My name is Diane. And the thing I want you to understand before I tell you any of this is that I did not go looking for a fight. I am not, by nature, a person who looks for fights. I am a person who shows up to things on time and sometimes early, who answers phone calls on the second ring, who sends the birthday cards and attends the family dinners and manages her own problems without broadcasting them and nods along at the table when conversations go in directions I disagree with because I have decided over the course of a lifetime that being consistently present is worth more than being occasionally right. I say this not to establish my virtue. I have plenty of faults and a therapist who can document them, but because the story I am about to tell you is one in which I eventually made a choice that other people in my position might not have made. I hired an attorney, I filed papers, I turned a family situation into a legal proceeding. I did this without my mother's full support and against my brother's explicit interests and over the objections of the part of myself that has spent 42 years trying to keep the peace. I want you to understand who that person is before you hear what she did. I am telling you this because what I eventually did, the letters I sent, the filings I requested, the attorney I hired, the questions I asked in depositions under oath will sound to some people like aggression, like someone who went looking for a fight and found one and dressed it up as principle. I didn't go looking for anything. I went looking for a charity. My father, Daniel, died on a Saturday in September. He was 72 years old. He had been sick for 2 years, a slow decline of the kind that gives you time to prepare, that lets you have the conversations you need to have, that seems like it's giving you a gift of time right up until the point where it becomes clear that no amount of time is actually sufficient preparation for the thing itself. He died at home, which is what he had said he wanted, in his own bedroom, in his own bed, with my mother Martha beside him and my brother Bobby in the next room and me on a plane that was on time and landed on time and got me to a cab on time, and I still arrived 40 minutes after he was gone. I want to tell you about those 40 minutes. Not because they're the most important part of what happened, they're not the part this story is about. But they are where this story starts for me, in the specific interior place where things that cannot be changed lodge themselves and become part of how you carry everything that follows. I was 40 minutes late. Bobby was there. Bobby had been there for the last 8 months, having moved back into my parents' house after a job situation that was my mother's phrase, a job situation delivered in the tone of someone who has decided that the specific details are not going to be shared and that any further inquiry will be declined politely but firmly. Bobby had been present for 8 months of my father's decline. Bobby had been in the house when my father said the things a person says at the end. Whatever my father had needed in those last hours, Bobby had been there to provide it. I had not been there. I had been 3 states away, living my life, calling on Sundays, visiting for the holidays, believing that the arrangement of my father being cared for by Bobby and my mother was temporary and that everyone was managing. I had not been wrong about the temporary part. I had perhaps been wrong about the everyone managing. I drove from the airport directly to my parents' house. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived, sitting very still at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. Bobby was in the living room, on the phone. He looked up when I came in and nodded and went back to his conversation. My father was upstairs, already gone. I sat at the kitchen table with my mother and held her hands and tried to be present for the thing that I had arrived too late to be present for. This is what grief asks you to do sometimes, to show up for the aftermath rather than the event, to do the work of mourning something you didn't fully witness. I tried. I don't know how well I succeeded. I know I was there. The will reading was 3 weeks after the funeral. I need to tell you about my parents' financial situation first because the will is incomprehensible without it, and because I want you to understand what was actually at stake, not as a dollar figure, but as a life's work. Daniel and Martha had not been wealthy people. They had been comfortable, which is a different word and a different reality. Comfortable means you have enough, that the decisions you make about money are made from a position of adequacy rather than scarcity, that you can cover what needs to be covered without extraordinary stress. It does not mean you have more than you need. My father had worked for 30 years as a civil engineer for the county. He had the same job at the same organization for 3 decades, which is a kind of steadiness that has become unusual enough that I think about it sometimes. The specific discipline required to show up to the same place and do the same work and build the same relationships for 30 years. He was not flashy about his career. He was competent and present and reliable, which are the things that county engineering departments need and that don't make for interesting dinner conversation, but that add up over 30 years to a pension and a reputation and a satisfaction that I think he genuinely felt. They had bought the house when they were young, and the neighborhood was ordinary. The neighborhood had changed. Cities grow around things, and what was ordinary becomes desirable, and the house my parents bought for practical reasons in a practical neighborhood turned out to be, 40 years later, in a neighborhood that other people were trying to get into. The house was worth significantly more than they had paid for it. It was worth significantly more than they had ever thought of it as being worth, because they had thought of it as where they lived rather than as an asset. My father had a retirement account, carefully managed. He had a modest life insurance policy. He had savings in a joint account with my mother that represented decades of putting aside what could be put aside without feeling it too acutely. He had not made spectacular investment decisions or inherited anything significant or stumbled into any windfall. He had simply been steady for 30 years, and steadiness had added up. He had told me once, sitting at the kitchen table, that the point of saving was to make sure the people you loved were okay after you were gone. He said it simply, without sentiment, as a statement of basic fact. He had asked me if I understood. I said yes. I had not known at the time how directly that conversation would come back to me. Gerald Oakes's office was downtown, a small practice, 2 attorneys, the kind of firm that has served the same families for 20 years and knows where all the documents are. I had been there once before, years ago, for a routine matter. The waiting room had not changed. The receptionist was the same. The chairs were the same. We sat down, me, my mother, Bobby, Gerald Oakes. Bobby had brought Carla. I noticed this but said nothing. Gerald Oakes had not, apparently, expected her, because he looked at her briefly and then looked at Bobby and then arranged his papers without commenting on her presence. He read the will. He read it in the careful, measured way that attorneys read documents in rooms where the stakes are high, not quickly, not with any editorial inflection, just the words in the order they appeared on the page, clause by clause, bequest by bequest. My parents were leaving their estate, the house, the retirement accounts, the savings, all of it to a charitable organization called the Hartfield Family Foundation. I heard the words. I sat with them for a moment. I said, "I'm sorry. Can you say that again?" Gerald Oakes said, "The estate in its entirety is designated to the Hartfield Family Foundation, a registered nonprofit organization." I said, "What is that?" He said, "It's a charitable foundation. Your father designated it as the sole beneficiary approximately 4 months before his death." I said, "I've never heard of it." He said, "It was established relatively recently." I said, "How recently?" He looked at his papers. He said the incorporation filing date was he paused, finding the document 11 days before your father signed the updated will. 11 days. I looked at Bobby. His eyes were on Gerald Oakes. His expression was the one he uses when he is paying careful attention and does not want you to know it. I looked at Carla. She was looking at her hands. I said, "Where is it located?" The foundation, Gerald Oakes said, the registered address is 4417 Connolly Street, apartment 2B. I said, "That's Bobby's apartment." No one said anything. I said, "Gerald, who are the directors?" He said, "The founding director is Carla Reyes." I looked at Carla. She looked at her hands. I want to tell you about who Bobby is because this story is not comprehensible without understanding the specific shape of him. Bobby is 2 years older than me. He is charming in the way that people are charming, when charm has always been sufficient, when it has opened doors and softened disappointments and gotten them out of situations that would have required other people to develop other skills. He is funny in the specific way that people are funny when they have paid attention to what works on an audience, when the humor is calibrated rather than spontaneous, when it lands correctly because it has been aimed. He is warm when he wants to be. He is the kind of person who makes a room feel good when he enters it and who leaves behind, when he goes, a faint sense that something has been taken that you can't quite identify. He had been, over the course of his adult life, a series of things that didn't last. Jobs, mostly he started things with genuine enthusiasm and left them for reasons that were always somewhat vague when examined directly. He had a talent for beginnings, the initial energy, the vision, the infectious confidence that this time it was going to be different. He could produce all of that with apparent sincerity. What he could not seem to produce was the slower, unglamorous work of sustaining something past the exciting phase into the difficult one. A business venture at 32 that my parents had invested in substantially and that had closed within 18 months with a loss that was never fully accounted for. A period of working in real estate that had ended without clear explanation, during which my parents had covered his rent for 4 months. A consulting arrangement that had been, as far as I could tell, primarily a way of describing being between other things, while my parents provided a financial cushion they described to me as temporary and that lasted, in various forms, for nearly 2 years. The job situation that had brought him back to my parents' house 8 months before my father died, I had asked my mother about it once, and she had said, "He just needs to get back on his feet, Diane." And I had understood that asking further was not going to get me more information and was going to cost me goodwill I might need later. My parents had never stopped believing in him. That is the thing about Bobby that is both the most understandable thing about my parents and the most directly relevant to what I eventually discovered. They loved him with the particular quality of love that some parents have for the child who needs more, a love that has been exercised more often, that has been called upon in more crises, that has developed through use, a kind of endurance that looks from the outside like preference. I had watched this my entire life. I had been, in the language my therapist eventually helped me find, the capable one, the one who solved her own problems, who didn't call with emergencies, who showed up to things and handled the logistics of her own life without requiring assistance. This is a role that sounds like a compliment and functions in families more like an invisibility. You get appreciated. You get thanked. You do not get the particular focused attention that goes to the person who is always almost making it, "I had made my peace with this," or something that functioned like peace, which is probably more accurate. I had built a life. I had a job I was good at, a city I had chosen, friendships that had grown from the roots up. I did not need my parents to focus on me the way they focused on Bobby. What I had not expected was for the consequence of their focus on Bobby to be what it turned out to be. I had not expected this. Let me tell you about Carla, because she matters too, and I have spent time trying to understand her accurately rather than simply as a villain, which is the easy version and probably not the complete one. Carla Reyes had been with Bobby for 3 years when my father died. I had met her 4 times. The first time was at a family dinner where she had been quiet in a way that I initially read as shyness and later revised, having met her again to attentiveness she was taking in the room, the dynamics, the relationships. The second time was at Christmas, where she had been warm and engaged and had brought a very good bottle of wine that she presented to my mother with a kind of deliberate consideration, the kind that comes from having thought about what would land well. The third and fourth times had been brief enough that I have only general impressions. She was attractive. She was smart in the way that some people are smart when they've decided to conceal it. She asked questions that seemed like interest and were, I think now, research. I do not know how much of what happened was her idea and how much was Bobby's. I suspect it was collaborative. I suspect it was the kind of thing that develops between two people who are both paying attention to the same opportunity and who find, in conversation, that they are both willing to take it. I do not know this for certain. The depositions did not produce a clean narrative of whose idea it was first. They produce documents and timelines and the particular evasiveness of people who have been advised by their attorney to say as little as possible. After the will reading, I drove to my mother's house. Bobby and Carla had left separately, quickly, without much conversation. Bobby had said he'd call later and had not made eye contact with me when he said it, which was, in retrospect, the most honest thing he did that day. I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table, the same table. It is always the same table in my family, the place where things get said, where things get not said, where the actual texture of our relationships gets worked out in the space between coffee cups and the particular silence of people who have known each other long enough to hear what's underneath the words. I asked her what she knew about the Hartfield Family Foundation. She said, Bobby explained it to me. It's a way of managing the estate for taxes. I said, Mom, the foundation is registered at Bobby's apartment. Carla Reyes is the founding director. It was incorporated 11 days before Dad signed the new will. 11 days. She looked at me with the expression she has used my entire life when I say something she doesn't want to process. It is not denial exactly. My mother is not a person who denies things. She is too intelligent for that, and she knows it about herself. It is more like a temporary suspension, a deliberate pausing of the machinery of understanding while she decides whether to let the information land. She said, Bobby explained that. It was already in the works. The timing was a coincidence. I said, Mom, a coincidence would be 30 days, 60 days. 11 days is not a coincidence. 11 days is a sequence. She said, he said it would be better for the estate, simpler. I said, has a single dollar from the foundation gone to any charitable purpose? She said, it's very new. I said, 4 months old. As of today? She said, Bobby is managing it. He knows about these things. I said, what does Bobby know about running a charitable foundation? She was quiet. I said, Mom, I need to ask you something directly. Was this Dad's idea? Did Dad come to Bobby and say, I want to create a foundation? Or did someone come to Dad with an idea already formed? She looked at the table. She said, I wasn't always in the room. I said, when you were in the room. She said, your father was tired, Diane. He was tired and he was in pain and he trusted Bobby. I heard what she was saying. I heard what she was not saying. I said, I know he trusted Bobby. I know Bobby was here. I know I wasn't here and Bobby was, and that matters, and I'm not dismissing it. But trusting someone and giving them control of everything you built are different things, and I need to know if Dad understood what he was signing. She said he was still himself. I said, I know he was still himself. Was he himself enough in those last months to fully understand a legal document about a charitable foundation he never mentioned to me? Long silence. She said, I don't know. That was the most honest thing said in that kitchen that week. I said, I need to look into this. I need to understand what the foundation actually is and what the plan actually is. I'm not doing it to hurt anyone. I'm doing it because Dad worked for 30 years and I want to make sure what he built goes where he intended. She said, Bobby says he intended this. I said, then there will be documents that show it. And if there are, I'll see them and I'll stop. She said, and if there aren't, I said, then we deal with that together. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She said, be careful, Diane. And that was all. I went home and I called Patricia Wren. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything in the order it had happened, the will reading, the foundation, the address, Carla's name, the 11 days, the management agreement for my mother's house that I had not yet seen, but that the Attorney General's inquiry would eventually surface. I told her about my mother's face when I asked whether Dad had truly understood what he was signing. I told her about Bobby hanging up. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, the timeline alone is significant. 11 days is not estate planning. 11 days is execution of a plan that already existed. I said, can we prove that? She said, we can establish it. Proof is a high bar. Establishment is what courts actually work with. We establish the timeline. We establish the cognitive impairment. We establish Bobby's role as caregiver and primary beneficiary. And we let the judge draw the conclusion that the facts support. I said, how long will this take? She said, 9 months minimum, possibly longer. I said, okay. She said, it will be expensive. I said, okay. She said, your mother may not support you through all of this. I said, I know. She said, are you prepared for that? I sat with the question. I thought about the kitchen table and my mother's face and the word careful and the 30 years my father had spent at the same job doing the same work so that what he built would go where he intended. I said, yes. She filed the following week. I heard what she was saying. I heard what she wasn't saying. I heard the weight of those 40 minutes that I had missed and the 8 months that Bobby had been present for, the daily presence that had accumulated into something my mother had decided was a kind of claim. I said, I understand that. And I also need to understand what the Hartfield Family Foundation is. She said, I trust your brother. I said, I know you do. I went home. I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Wren. She had been recommended by a friend, not an estate attorney, a friend who had been through a complicated family situation and had found someone who was both competent and willing to tell you things you didn't want to hear. Patricia Wren was both of those things. She listened to everything I told her, asked 4 precise questions, and said, we need to look at the foundation's filing documents. Nonprofit incorporations are public records. This is something I had not known before that week and have not forgotten since. When you file to create a nonprofit organization, the documents go into the public record and anyone can request them. I did not know this. Patricia Wren did. The documents arrived 7 days later. The Hartfield Family Foundation had been incorporated as a nonprofit organization in our state 11 days before my father signed his updated will. Its stated purpose was support of family wellness and community enrichment initiatives. Its registered address was 4417 Connolly Street, Apartment 2B. Its founding director was Carla Reyes. Its registered agent, the person legally responsible for receiving official correspondence on behalf of the foundation, was Bobby. Bobby was not listed as a director. Bobby was not listed as an officer. Bobby was the registered agent, which is a specific legal role that exists one step behind the visible leadership, a role that has formal responsibilities and that requires specifically a permanent address at which to receive mail. Bobby's name was on the foundation, just far enough back to be, at first glance, invisible. Patricia Wren looked at the documents for a long time. Then she said, "This is either very sloppy estate planning or something more deliberate. Either way, we have grounds to challenge the will." I said, "On what basis?" She said, "Lack of testamentary capacity, potentially depending on your father's medical records from the period when the will was updated. Undue influence, which is harder to prove but very applicable to situations involving a caregiver, and potentially, depending on what the foundation actually does with the assets, fraud. But we start with the will." I said, "My mother doesn't want to do this." Patricia said, "What does your mother want?" I said, "She wants to trust Bobby." Patricia said, "That's her right. But you have standing to challenge independently as a disinherited heir. You don't need her cooperation." I sat with that. The idea of doing this without my mother's support, against the express preference of a woman who had just lost her husband and who wanted, more than anything, to believe that her son was not what the documents suggested he might be. I sat with it for a long time. I called Bobby. I want to be accurate about this conversation because it matters and because I have replayed it many times, and I want to give it to you the way it actually was. I told Bobby I had seen the foundation documents. I told him I had questions. I told him I was not calling to accuse him of anything, but that I needed to understand what the plan was, what the foundation was going to do with the estate, when it was going to do it, what charitable purpose it was going to serve. Bobby said, "It's complicated, Diane." I said, "Explain it to me." He said, "Dad wanted to leave a legacy. He didn't want it just sitting in accounts." I said, "The foundation's address is your apartment." He said, "Carla and I are managing it from there, temporarily." I said, "Bobby." The foundation was incorporated 11 days before Dad changed his will. Who suggested it? Silence. I said, "Did Dad come up with this on his own? Did Gerald Oakes suggest it? Or did someone else suggest it?" He said, "Dad wanted this." I said, "I want to believe that." He said, "Then believe it." I said, "Help me believe it. Show me the documentation. Show me Dad's notes, his correspondence with the attorney, anything that shows this was his idea and not something he was presented with when he was sick and tired and in pain." Bobby said, "I don't have to show you anything." I said, "No, you don't, but I'm going to request it anyway." He hung up. I filed the will contest the following week. Patricia Wren filed on my behalf, citing undue influence and requesting a full accounting of my father's decision-making capacity in the 4 months before his death. We subpoenaed his medical records. We requested the correspondence between my father and Gerald Oakes. We asked the state attorney general's office, which oversees nonprofit organizations, to open an inquiry into the Hartfield Family Foundation. The medical records were the first significant piece. My father had been diagnosed with a mild cognitive impairment 8 months before he died. Not dementia, not a full incapacity, but a documented, clinically established decline in executive function and decision-making that his neurologist had been monitoring and that had been, according to the records, progressing in the months before the will change. The same months during which Bobby had moved back into the house, the same months during which the foundation had been incorporated, the same months during which my father had, for the first time in 40 years of marriage, updated his estate plan without his longtime attorney's initiation and without telling his daughter, Gerald Oakes. When deposed, said something that I think about often. He said, Daniel seems certain. He came in with the foundation documents already prepared. He knew what he wanted. But I will say, and I said it at the time, I thought the timing was unusual. I recommended he take more time. He said he'd already decided. He came in with the foundation documents already prepared. He came in with them, meaning they existed before he arrived at Gerald Oakes's office, meaning someone had prepared them and handed them to my father to bring. The Attorney General's inquiry moved slowly, as these things do, but it moved, and as it moved, several things came to light. The Hartfield Family Foundation had, in its 4 months of existence before my father died, received exactly 0 donations from any source other than a single $50 founding contribution. It had distributed exactly $0 to any charitable purpose. It had, however, opened a bank account, and that bank account had been established with Carla Reyes as the sole signatory. It had also, in the month before my father died, entered into a management agreement with a property company for the purpose of, and I am reading from the actual document here because the language is so specific that paraphrasing it would lose something, facilitating the eventual transition of residential real estate assets into the foundation's investment portfolio. The residential real estate, the house, my parents' house, where my mother still lived, was going to be transitioned into the foundation's investment portfolio. While my mother was living in it, my mother did not know this. When Patricia Wren showed her the management agreement, she went very quiet. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and she read the document, and she went quiet in the way she goes quiet when something has reached her at a level that is beneath the surface of what she shows. Then she said, I want to talk to Bobby. She called him. He came over. I was not in the house when he arrived. She asked me to give them time alone, which I did, which was one of the harder things I have done in this entire process. She called me afterward. She said, he says it's all legitimate. He says the property management was for tax purposes. I said, Mom, Carla is the only person who can sign checks from the foundation account. Bobby is the registered agent. There are no charitable programs. The foundation exists for 11 days before Dad signs a new will, leaving everything to it. Does any part of that feel like tax planning to you? She was quiet. Then she said, I don't know who to believe. I said, I know, I understand that, and I am not asking you to take my word for it. I am asking you to let the process find out what's true. That's all. She said, what if it's true? What Bobby did? I said, then we deal with that. She said, he's my son. I said, I know he is. The process found out what was true. Not all at once. These things do not happen all at once. And anyone who tells you they do has not been through one. They happen in increments, over months, in the slow accumulation of documents and depositions, and the particular exhaustion of a legal process that requires you to keep showing up when everything in you would prefer to be done. What we established over 9 months of legal process. My father had been presented with the foundation concept by Bobby and Carla approximately 3 weeks before the foundation was incorporated. The timing was established through phone records and through a deposition from my father's neighbor, a woman named Helen Cho, who had known my parents for 15 years and who had been present, by coincidence, at a kitchen table conversation in which Bobby had introduced the concept. Helen said my father had seemed confused. She said he had asked Bobby twice what the foundation was for. She said Bobby had said, tax purposes, Dad, it's all for tax purposes. She said my father had eventually nodded. She said Daniel was not himself in those last months. I want to be honest about that. He was still Daniel, but he was slower. Things took longer to land. My father had, according to Gerald Oakes's deposition, not initiated the appointment to update his will. Bobby had called the office and scheduled it. Gerald Oakes said this was unusual. He said he had known Daniel for 20 years, and Daniel had always called himself when he needed something. He said when Daniel came in, he had the foundation documents already with him, already prepared, already complete. Gerald Oakes had asked where they came from. Daniel had said Bobby helped put them together. Gerald Oakes said, I asked him if he was sure. He said he was sure. I should have pushed harder. That is something I have thought about. The foundation had no legitimate charitable program. Carla, in her deposition, described the foundation's charitable mission as being in development. She described specific plans that changed between her first deposition and her second, which is the kind of inconsistency that attorneys notice and juries, if it had come to a jury, would have noticed too. She could not name a single grant that had been made, a single program that had been funded, a single external recipient of any kind. She said, these things take time to develop. Patricia Wren said, you've had 11 months. Carla said, yes. Patricia Wren said, and in 11 months you have made no grants, funded no programs, and served no charitable purpose. Carla said, we've been in a planning phase. Patricia Wren said, planning for what? Carla said, for the work we intend to do. Patricia Wren said, what work? Carla said, family wellness initiatives. Patricia Wren said, can you describe a single family wellness initiative the foundation has planned? Carla said, we're still developing the specifics. The specifics were never developed. The foundation had no specifics. It had an address, a bank account with a sole signatory, a registered agent who was the address holder's boyfriend, and a management agreement for a piece of residential real estate that my mother was currently living in. The management agreement was, in some ways, the detail that most clearly illuminated what the plan actually was. A property management company, a small one, 2 employees, registered 6 months before the foundation had been engaged by the foundation to manage the residential property at my parents' home address. The management agreement gave the company authority to facilitate the eventual sale or development of the property. The property management company's sole director was listed as Robert Hartfield. Bobby had incorporated a property management company under his middle name, Robert Hartfield. The foundation was named the Hartfield Family Foundation. He had used his middle name as the brand and hoped, apparently, that no one would connect the two. Patricia Wren presented this to the judge with the particular restraint of a lawyer who has learned that the facts, in certain cases, do more work when they are simply stated than when they are argued. She stated them. She let them be what they were. The judge found in my favor on the grounds of undue influence, citing the cognitive impairment documentation, the timeline of the foundation's creation, the circumstances of the will signing, and Bobby's role as both caregiver and primary beneficiary. He voided the updated will. He reinstated the previous one. Bobby did not look at me after the ruling. He gathered his things and he left with his attorney, and I have not spoken to him since. That was 14 months ago. My mother sat in the courtroom through the entire hearing. She sat very still. When the ruling was read, she did not react visibly, not relief, not grief, not the complicated expression of a woman watching one child win and another lose in the same sentence. She sat still, and then she stood, and then she walked to the corridor, and I followed her. She said, I need some time. I said, take all the time you need. She called me 3 days later. She said, I'm glad you did it. I couldn't have done it myself. I'm glad you did it. I said, I know, Mom. She said, he's still my son. I said, I know that too. She said, I don't know what to do with that. I said, neither do I. We'll figure it out. We have not figured it out entirely. I do not think that's the kind of thing you figure out entirely. Bobby is still her son. He is still my brother. He is the person who was present when my father died and the person who used that presence to do what he did. And those two things are both true, and I have stopped expecting them to resolve into something simpler because they don't. Carla Reyes dissolved the Hartfield Family Foundation 6 weeks after the ruling. The dissolution was filed at the same address, 4417 Connolly Street, apartment 2B. I want to be honest about what it cost. Not the legal fees, though those were significant. 9 months of estate litigation is not inexpensive, and I paid for it from my own savings, money I had put aside over years for a different purpose, money I had not planned to spend this way. I mean, the other costs, the ones that don't appear on an invoice. My mother spent 9 months not knowing which child to believe. She spent 9 months watching her daughter build a legal case against her son, watching the family she had spent 40 years constructing become something that required attorneys to navigate. She aged in those 9 months in a way that was not simply time, it was the particular aging that comes from sustained uncertainty, from carrying something you cannot set down, from waking up every morning inside a situation you cannot resolve by deciding. Bobby spent 9 months in some version of what it feels like to have done what he did and to be in the process of having it exposed. I don't know what those 9 months were like for him. I have not asked and I will not ask. But I think about it sometimes what it costs internally to sit in a deposition and describe a planning phase for charitable programs that do not exist, to watch the documents being laid on a table one by one, to understand that the thing you thought would not be found has been found. I spent 9 months being the person who had made this happen, the person who had hired the attorney, the person who had filed the papers and issued the subpoenas and pursued the inquiry and sat in Gerald Oakes's deposition room and watched a man 20 years older than me struggle with whether to tell the truth about my father's final months. I spent 9 months being the person who had decided that the thing my father had built over 30 years of steady work and careful saving was worth the fight it cost to protect it. I have asked myself whether I would do it again. I have sat with that question many times in the quiet of my own apartment, in the middle of nights when I couldn't sleep, in the months after the ruling when the relief was real, but the weight of what it had required was also real. I have not arrived at a clean answer. I think I would. I think I had to. But I do not think it was cost-free, and I am suspicious of anyone who does a thing like this and claims it was easy or simple or clearly right in every dimension. My mother and I are careful with each other now. The word I keep returning to is careful. We are attentive with each other, deliberate in a way that we were not before. She knows that I was right. She has never said those words exactly. She says it in other ways. In the calls she makes when she is uncertain about something practical, in the way she asks me to look over documents before she signs them, in the fact that she called me 3 days after the ruling and said, "I'm glad you did it," which is the closest she has come to saying the thing directly and which I have decided is enough. She says Bobby comes by sometimes. She says it neutrally, in the way she says things she wants me to know without asking me to have a reaction to them. I say, okay, I do not ask questions. I have decided that the question of Bobby and my mother is theirs to navigate, that my role in it is to be present when she needs me and absent when she doesn't, and to refrain from the particular kind of commentary that would put her in the position of choosing between us again. He is still her son. I have made my peace with that sentence. The house is still hers. She lives in it. She has repainted the front door a deep green she had always wanted and my father had always voted against. which seems like the right kind of small rebellion for a woman in her 70s who has just survived something large. The kitchen table is still in the kitchen. When I visit, I bring coffee from the place she likes, and we sit at the table and we talk about ordinary things, the garden, the neighbors, a book she's reading, what I've been working on. Sometimes we don't talk about much at all. Sometimes we just sit. That is enough. That is more than enough. My father worked for 30 years at the same steady job. He took one vacation a year. He paid off the house incrementally, year by year, without drama. He saved carefully and consistently for a future he planned to leave to his children equally, in the simple and direct way of a person who believed that fairness was not complicated. He got sick and he got tired and he trusted the person who was there, and the person who was there had decided, with the assistance of someone else, to use that trust. I filed the papers. I sat in the depositions. I waited for 9 months. The house is still my mother's. My share of the estate is in an account. My father's life insurance paid out equally, the way he intended. The Hartfield Family Foundation was dissolved on a Tuesday morning, and the dissolution was filed at 4417 Connolly Street, apartment 2B, which is still Bobby's address, where the letters went. Where the paper trail ended, he got nothing. The thing he had built the foundation to receive passed to the people it was always meant to go to. I did it for my father. That is what I tell myself. That is true enough to carry. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done. Fireside Stories. New episodes 3 to 4 times each week. I'll see you at the next one.